Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're dimming the lights, settling way down, maybe grabbing a pillow, and we're going to float gently through the surprisingly strange, sometimes dark, but always medically fascinating history of one of the 20th century's most infamous and versatile molecules, ketamine. It's a story that starts with a search for a better way to knock people out, moves through the jungles of Southeast Asia, and ends up, where else, on the dance floors and in the psychotherapy clinics of the modern world. It's a pharmaceutical journey, so get comfortable. Maybe put your phone on silent, because we're not rushing this one. The prehistory: anesthesia's unwanted side effects. To understand why ketamine was even invented, we have to briefly, and I mean briefly, look back at the state of anesthesia in the middle of the 20th century. For a very long time, medical science had been trying to find the perfect general anesthetic. You know, the drug that lets you cut someone open without them noticing, screaming, or, most importantly, dying from the drug itself. In the 1950s and early 60s, a very popular option, a real superstar of the operating theater, was a drug called phencyclidine. Now, you might be thinking that name sounds slightly familiar. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. But it has a much better known street name, which is PCP, or as it's sometimes dramatically called, angel dust. Yes, for a while, doctors were actually using something that we now associate with, well, let's just say disorientation and people doing slightly unhinged things as an anesthetic. And initially, it seemed like a miracle. PCP was developed in the late 1950s by a pharmaceutical company called Parke-Davis. Its chemical name was CI-581. It was a potent anesthetic, providing excellent analgesia, which is pain relief, and what they called a dissociative state. This is where the patient feels disconnected from their own body, from their pain, and from the environment. It was very effective at knocking people out for surgery, but unlike some older anesthetics, it didn't slow down the breathing or the heart quite as much. It didn't cause the respiratory depression that could make older drugs so dangerous. So, medically speaking, it was a breakthrough. But of course, because this is pharmaceutical history, there was a snag. A big, psychedelic, extremely upsetting snag. When patients woke up from the PCP anesthetic, they often didn't just wake up. They woke up angrily, or they woke up psychotically, or they woke up hallucinating and delusional. It wasn't a gentle return to reality. It was a jarring, terrifying, often violent transition back to consciousness. The medical term for this awful experience is emergence delirium or emergence phenomena. And with PCP, this side effect was so frequent, so severe, and so lasting, sometimes going on for several days, that it was quickly deemed unsuitable for general human use. It was almost immediately pulled from the human market, though it found a brief, less problematic use in veterinary medicine, where a waking dog that was a little confused was easier to deal with than a waking human who was trying to fight the nurses. So, Parke-Davis had a problem. They had a drug that worked almost perfectly as an anesthetic, but made people completely lose their minds when they woke up. They needed something with the same dissociative, pain-killing effect, but without the terrifying psychedelic hangover. Enter the hero, or at least our main scientific protagonist, gently steps into the narrative. His name was Dr. Calvin Stevens. He was a brilliant organic chemist at Wayne State University in Detroit, and he was working as a consultant for Parke-Davis. In 1962, Parke-Davis gave Stevens the chemical equivalent of a difficult homework assignment. Please design a chemical that is metabolically similar to PCP, but one that breaks down much faster in the human body. The hypothesis was that the terrifying emergence delirium was caused by PCP hanging around in the patient's system for too long. If the drug could just do its job, put the patient out, and then quickly vacate the premises, maybe the side effects would disappear. It was a systematic, slightly dry-sounding process of modifying the PCP molecule. Think of it like a scientist sitting in a lab, playing with molecular Legos, swapping out one piece for another, hoping the new shape would fit perfectly into the body's metabolic machinery. Stevens and his team started with the PCP core structure and began introducing new elements, specifically targeting the cyclohexylamine ring. They produced a series of new compounds, each given a boring, forgettable number designation, CI-400, CI-420, CI-440, and so on. The one we care about is the compound that Stevens' team synthesized in 1962, a molecule that was structurally different from PCP by the simple addition of a keto group and a chlorine atom. And this little addition, this tweak, made all the difference. It was originally named CI-581, and in a laboratory notebook under the date 1962, it was described as a promising agent. This CI-581, this chemical modification, was designed specifically to be broken down quickly by the liver, thus avoiding the long, slow, agonizing washout of PCP. And because of the inclusion of the keto group, this new chemical would eventually be named ketamine. It's just an abbreviation of the functional group, keto-eel-amine. A very logical and utterly unexciting name for a molecule that would go on to have quite an exciting life. The testing phase, the first human trials. Now, once they had CI-581, they had to test it. The initial animal tests in rats, monkeys, and baboons were incredibly promising. They confirmed the analgesic and anesthetic properties were similar to PCP, but the recovery was much smoother. The monkeys didn't wake up trying to tear the cages apart. A big win for the monkeys and for science. The task of running the first human trials fell to a brilliant anesthesiologist named Dr. Edward F. Domino, which is just a great name for a medical pioneer, and his colleague Dr. Gunter Korsen, both working at the University of Michigan. In 1964, they started administering CI-581 to human volunteers. These were usually inmates at a state prison in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Yes, this was the era when medical testing on prison populations was considered routine and acceptable. They were often paid a nominal amount, and their participation was usually billed as voluntary. The ethics of this, of course, is a whole other 1.5-hour monologue for another night. The initial results were fascinating. In these volunteers, the drug produced a state that Domino dubbed dissociative anesthesia. The patient would be non-responsive, eyes sometimes open, sometimes displaying a strange fluttering nystagmus, a rapid, involuntary movement of the eyes. They wouldn't respond to painful stimuli, and their cardiovascular and respiratory functions, their breathing and their heart rate, remained remarkably stable. They were, for all intents and purposes, a perfect surgical patient. They were out.
But when the subjects were brought back, the difference from the PCP experience was night and day. There was some confusion, some strange dreaming, a bit of blurred vision, maybe a bit of floating sensation, but nothing like the full-blown, days-long psychotic break of PCP. The recovery was fast, it was smooth, it was a chemical success. Domino wrote a pivotal paper in 1965, coining the term dissociative anesthetic to describe this unique state. He noted that the subjects felt a profound separation between the mind and the body. One subject in the early trials famously described the experience as feeling like their mind was disconnected from their body, floating a few feet above. Another described feeling as though their consciousness was in one corner of the room, watching the procedure. The name ketamine was officially adopted, and in 1966, Parke-Davis applied for a patent. They had found their answer to the PCP problem. It was effective, fast, and most importantly, the psychological effects were transient. They faded quickly. Parke-Davis saw dollar signs. They now had a perfect new anesthetic that could be used widely in surgical settings, especially in places where a full-service operating room with fancy equipment was not available, because ketamine didn't require complicated ventilation equipment. It was a one-drug show. But before they could roll it out to the civilian world, the drug needed a proper field test. And in the late 1960s, there was one place where a quick, portable, and reliable anesthetic was desperately needed: Vietnam. The Vietnam trial, Ketamine on the battlefield. In 1967, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, officially approved ketamine for clinical use. Parke-Davis marketed it under the trade name Ketamine. It was an injectable liquid, ready to go. The U.S. military immediately grasped its potential. Here was a drug that could be administered quickly to a wounded soldier on the battlefield or in a MASH unit, often by medics who weren't formally trained anesthesiologists. It could stabilize a soldier for transit, allow for quick field surgeries, and critically, it was less likely to drop their blood pressure or stop their breathing, which was a constant, terrifying risk with other battlefield anesthetics. Older anesthetics, like the barbiturates, were cardiodepressant. They would lower the blood pressure, which is exactly what you don't want to happen to a soldier who is already suffering from massive blood loss and hypovolemic shock. Ketamine, beautifully, was cardiostimulant. It actually tends to increase the heart rate and blood pressure, making it the perfect drug for trauma victims who are already circling the drain due to shock. It was, in this very specific life-and-death context, a miracle drug. So Ketamine was deployed heavily to the MASH units, the trauma centers, and even right on the front lines in Vietnam. It quickly earned a reputation among the medics as a battlefield godsend. It was easy to administer intramuscularly, which means just sticking a needle into a big muscle, and it worked fast. And this is where the first stories of ketamine's unique and strange psychological properties really began to circulate outside of the clinical trial reports. Soldiers naturally were not given the drug in a quiet, climate-controlled, peaceful setting. They were given it in the middle of a war zone. When they came out of the ketamine state, or as the effects were off, they didn't just experience confusion. They experienced what seemed to be a series of extremely vivid and often frightening hallucinations or out-of-body experiences, what they called ketamine dreams. These weren't necessarily the gentle, floating feeling described in the quiet prison trials. These were often intense, sensory overload experiences, sometimes reflecting the trauma they had just undergone. But again, these effects were short-lived. A few hours of confusion was an acceptable trade-off for a life saved. The deployment of Ketamine in Vietnam solidified ketamine's reputation as a vital, indispensable anesthetic, particularly in extreme trauma cases. By the end of the 1960s, this chemical tweet, the simple addition of a keto and chlorine group to the PCP molecule, had transformed a dangerous laboratory curiosity into a key piece of life-saving military hardware. It was a drug born in the lab, but raised in a very real and literal way on the battlefield. And that, in its first decade, was the story of ketamine, a scientific quest for a better anesthetic, a smooth transition through human trials, and a baptism by fire in the jungles of war. But this is only the beginning. Once a drug is out in the world, once its mind-altering properties are known, it tends to find its way into places the original chemists never intended. Let's float over now gently to the 1970s and see how a military anesthetic jumped the fence and found its way onto the streets and into the mind of a very eccentric psychotherapist. We've established that by the early 1970s, ketamine was firmly entrenched in the legitimate medical world. It was used in operating rooms for procedures on children, the elderly, and as we know, in trauma medicine. It was reliable, it was fast, and the lingering side effects, while present, were manageable within a clinical setting. But the 1970s, as we all know, were a time when boundaries were, well, they were loose, especially when it came to mind-altering substances. Remember how the first human trials noted that ketamine created a state of intense dissociation, the feeling of the mind separating from the body. Doctors like Edward Domino had carefully described this as a clinical phenomenon. But what the clinical reports didn't capture was the depth of the subjective experience, the feeling of suddenly having access to strange new mental landscapes. This unique effect was not lost on a small but very influential fringe group of psychiatrists and researchers who were already deeply immersed in the world of psychedelic drugs. You have to remember the context. LSD, Psilocybin and mescaline had been intensely studied and then intensely restricted throughout the 1960s. The medical community was reeling from the counterculture embrace of these drugs, which led to a massive, politically motivated crackdown on research. All of a sudden, all the avenues for exploring altered states of consciousness in a therapeutic setting were slammed shut. But the chemists kept working, and when a new compound emerges, one that creates profound, short-term alterations in perception, it's only time before someone tries to use it for therapy or for self-exploration. The New Frontier, Dr. John C. Lilly, and the Dolphin Dream. The first major figure to really push ketamine out of the operating theater and into the realm of consciousness exploration was a true eccentric, a man whose life sounds like it was lifted straight from a bad science fiction novel. Dr. John C. Lilly. He was a neuroscientist, a psychoanalyst, and a biophysicist. But he is most famous for his work starting in the late 1950s studying dolphins. He genuinely believed that dolphins had a complex language and intelligence that humans could unlock. His work involved building the first sensory deprivation tanks, floating devices intended to eliminate external stimuli and allow the brain to focus entirely on its own internal world. His research was usually conducted in incredibly isolated, strange labs, often in the Caribbean. In the 1960s, Lilly was heavily experimenting with LSD in these tanks, trying to communicate with his dolphin subjects, and of course, exploring his own mind. By the early 1970s, he had discovered ketamine. Immediately, Lilly saw ketamine as the next logical step past LSD. The effects were quicker, more intense, but crucially, they were shorter. LSD lasts 8 to 12 hours. Ketamine lasts maybe an hour, hour and a half at most for a full dose experience. For a man obsessed with quick access to deep states of consciousness, this was perfect. He could dive deep, take notes, and be back for dinner. Lilly's method, which he wrote about extensively in books like The Scientist and The Center of the Cyclone, was to take ketamine while floating in his sensory deprivation tank. He essentially combined the two most intense forms of altered consciousness he could find. And in this strange, watery, chemically induced state, Lilly claimed to experience profound, almost cosmic breakthroughs. He wrote about contacting extraterrestrial intelligence, communicating directly with dolphin minds, and traversing various dimensions. He developed his own complex, mystical terminology for the ketamine state, describing various layers of consciousness and external realities. This is where the term K-hole arguably gained its first professional usage. It wasn't a party term yet. For Lilly, the K-hole was a deep, non-responsive, dissociative state where one's consciousness was completely separated from their body, traveling through deep space or alternate realities. He treated it not as a side effect, but as the therapeutic goal. Lilly's writings, which were very popular in esoteric and counterculture circles, acted as the first major vector for ketamine's diffusion outside of the official medical channels. His work essentially rebranded a military anesthetic as a powerful tool for spiritual and philosophical exploration. Of course, the medical establishment was absolutely horrified by all of this. Here was a respected scientist using a powerful, newly approved drug to talk to imaginary alien computers and dolphins. It certainly didn't help the drug's reputation in the eyes of the conservative medical community, who quickly dismissed ketamine research that ventured into the mind as the work of cranks and LSD holdovers. Meanwhile, in the same time frame, the mid-1970s,
the drug was also starting to pop up in the recreational drug scene, primarily in major U.S. cities like New York and San Francisco. Remember, ketamine, unlike cocaine or heroin, was originally mass-produced for medical purposes. It wasn't grown in a field or cooked in a bathtub from industrial chemicals. It was a legitimate pharmaceutical product sold in vials to hospitals and clinics. This meant that the street drug was often simply diverted from veterinarian clinics or pilfered from hospital stocks. Ketamine was widely used in veterinary medicine, often for large animals like horses and cattle, which is why it often carried the nickname horse tranquilizer. It was surprisingly easy for someone, a bored vet tech, a disgruntled hospital worker, or an opportunistic thief, to slip a few vials into a bag. On the street, it was initially known by names like Kit Kat, or most famously, Special K. The effects, as we know, were unique. Unlike the energizing rush of amphetamines or the mellowing effect of downers, Special K offered a quick, intense trip that produced a profound physical heaviness and mental disconnection. People weren't using it for long trips. They were using it for a fast, intense, short-lived experience. The recreational use started small, concentrated in certain experimental circles and among those already familiar with the psychedelic scene. It was seen as a strange, new entry, providing a different kind of altered state that was less emotional and more purely perceptual than LSD. It gave users that strange, floating, detached feeling without the 8-hour commitment. Because it was diverted medicine, it also had the advantage of being perceived as relatively clean compared to other street drugs, though the physical and mental risks were obviously very real, especially when people started trying to mix it with other substances. By the end of the 1970s, ketamine was officially in two entirely different worlds. The sterile world, used by military medics in the field, by pediatric surgeons, and by veterinarians. This was the majority of its use. The shadow world, used by eccentric neuroscientists like John C. Lilly, exploring dimensions in water tanks, and by a small, discerning group of drug users looking for a new kind of high. These two worlds rarely intersected, which is probably why its medical utility remains so strong, despite the strange stories circulating outside the hospital walls. But there was also a quiet third front opening up for ketamine, a very serious, if unsung, therapeutic movement that kept the spirit of psychedelic psychiatry alive while American and European governments were banning everything. In the 1970s and 80s, a Chilean psychiatrist named Claudio Naranjo was quietly working with ketamine, exploring its potential as a tool for psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. Naranjo had been involved in early research on drugs like MDMA and had studied under figures like Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy. When the doors to mainstream psychedelic research slammed shut, Naranjo didn't stop. He simply looked for compounds that weren't yet on the controlled substance lists, and ketamine, being a relatively new anesthetic, fit the bill perfectly. He and his colleagues began using ketamine, combined with talk therapy, to help patients access repressed memories and confront traumatic experiences. The dissociative state, in their hands, wasn't a side effect. It was a psychological shield. By detaching the mind from the body and the physical sense of self, the patient could view their own traumatic memories, fears, and internal conflicts from a distance. They were, quite literally, dissociating from their pain to look at it objectively. Naranjo called this method psycholytic therapy, meaning mind loosening. He documented the use of ketamine in hundreds of sessions, noting that the patient's defenses were lowered, allowing for rapid therapeutic breakthroughs that might take months or years of conventional therapy to achieve. Unlike Lilly's cosmic dolphin journeys, Naranjo's work was grounded in serious, if unconventional, psychoanalysis. He wasn't looking for aliens, he was looking for the root of human suffering. This work was almost entirely ignored by the American and European medical communities, who remained allergic to anything that smelled like psychedelic therapy. But in South America and among a small, interconnected group of international therapists, the knowledge that ketamine held profound therapeutic potential was quietly kept alive. So, as the 1980s rolled in, ketamine had achieved a truly unique and strange status. It was a boring, essential anesthetic in hospitals, a mind-bending party drug for a niche crowd, and a deep, therapeutic tool for a handful of dedicated, slightly outcast psychiatrists. It was living 3 separate lives, and we'll see how these lives eventually, and ironically, came back together. Let's now drift forward a bit to the late 80s and the 90s, where ketamine's life as a party drug really takes off, and its reputation enters a much darker, much more public phase. We are now gently floating into the late 1980s and the 1990s. If the 1970s was about ketamine finding its niche in the shadows of science and counterculture, the 1990s were about it exploding into the public consciousness, though not in a good way, as a primary feature of global nightlife. This is the era when Special K became synonymous with a certain kind of party atmosphere, moving far beyond the small esoteric circles of New York and San Francisco and becoming a truly global phenomenon. And, as usually happens when a drug becomes popular on the street, the medical and regulatory world eventually has to catch up, often with a slow, grinding bureaucracy. The rave revolution and the rise of Special K. The 1990s saw the global rise of the rave scene, an international subculture based around electronic music, marathon dancing sessions, and crucially, the use of certain synthetic drugs. While MDMA, or ecstasy, was the undisputed champion of the early rave scene, ketamine started to gain serious traction as the decade progressed. It offered something different. MDMA was for connection, for energy, for dancing all night. Ketamine, ironically, offered the opposite. It was for slowing down, for sitting quietly in a corner, for turning inward, and for achieving that profound, short-lived dissociation. It became known as a late-night drug, something to wind down the party or to intensify the final hours. The popularity was fueled by its unique legal status. For most of the 90s, ketamine was not a Schedule I controlled substance like LSD or heroin, which were deemed to have no medical value and high abuse potential. Ketamine was still a widely used legitimate anesthetic. This made possession laws significantly fuzzier and often less punitive than those applied to drugs like cocaine or ecstasy, at least initially. And its availability was still primarily based on diversion. The drug was rarely manufactured illicitly. Instead, its source continued to be veterinary medicine. Imagine huge production lines in pharmaceutical labs pumping out vials of ketamine destined for hospitals and vet clinics around the world, and then imagining the relative ease with which cases of these vials could be redirected into the illegal market, especially through countries with weaker regulatory oversight. This led to a strange and very widespread trade route, often involving ketamine being legally manufactured in places like India, diverted to countries with a thriving club scene like the US, UK, or Germany, and then smuggled in its pure liquid injectable form, or more often, cooked down into a grainy white powder. The conversion process from liquid to powder is actually quite simple, which helped it spread. Ketamine is sold as a liquid solution, usually in 10 milliliter vials. To use it as a powder to snort, people would simply pour the liquid onto a flat surface, often a Pyrex dish or a dinner plate, and heat it gently until the water evaporated. What was left was the pure, crystallized ketamine hydrochloride, ready to be scraped up and used. This kitchen chemistry process meant that the Special K sold on the street was often remarkably pure, being straight pharmaceutical grade. It was a level of purity rarely found in other street drugs, and this reliability, coupled with the unique effects, made it highly desirable. However, the nature of the drug, the intense dissociation, also led to significant, sometimes tragic problems. The dangers of dissociation and the K-hole. While John C. Lilly treated the K-hole as a transcendental experience, on the dance floor it was often a deeply frightening, disorienting, and sometimes physically dangerous event. Remember, the K-hole is a state of profound dissociation and immobility. You become temporarily paralyzed and entirely disconnected from your body. In a quiet, supervised setting, this is one thing. In a crowded, dark, loud nightclub, it's a recipe for disaster. Users could suddenly lose all physical control,
fall over, hit their head, and most commonly, they would lose control of their bladder. This public incontinence became a dark, embarrassing sign of overconsumption in the club scene, adding a specific layer of indignity to the risks. More seriously, the intense disorientation could lead to accidents. People would stumble out into traffic or wander into dangerous situations, completely incapable of processing the world around them. The short duration of the drug also led to quick redosing. Since the intense effects only lasted 30 to 60 minutes, users would often take subsequent, larger doses, chasing the high or trying to maintain the dissociative state. This practice quickly led to dependence and a dramatic increase in the associated medical complications. The wake-up call, cystitis, and the bladder. The prolonged, heavy, and repeated recreational use of ketamine in the late 1990s and early 2000s exposed a dark side that was entirely unknown during the original short-term surgical trials: ketamine-induced cystitis, or K-cystitis. People who used ketamine heavily, often daily and at high doses, began showing up in emergency rooms with catastrophic damage to their urinary tracts. The symptoms were horrific: intense, chronic, debilitating bladder pain, frequent and urgent urination, and eventually bleeding from the bladder. Doctors slowly figured out that the ketamine, or more likely its specific metabolites, the chemicals produced when the body breaks down the drug, were toxic to the fragile lining of the bladder, the urothelium. Prolonged exposure would cause the lining to ulcerate, thicken, and scar, permanently shrinking the capacity of the bladder. This wasn't a temporary side effect. In severe cases, patients developed bladders that could hold only tiny amounts of urine, requiring them to urinate dozens of times a day and even throughout the night. It led to life-altering, chronic pain, and for some, required radical, life-changing surgery, such as having their bladder removed entirely and replaced with an external pouch. This medical crisis was a definitive sign that ketamine abuse was no longer a fringe issue. It was a major public health concern, and this serious, permanent physical damage finally pushed the hand of the regulators. The regulatory slowdown, scheduling the anesthetic. As the evidence mounted, the rise in recreational use, the increase in emergency room visits, and the discovery of the devastating K-cystitis, the regulatory bodies, particularly the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, had to act. In 1999, the DEA officially placed ketamine into Schedule III of the Controlled Substances Act in the United States. Now, this is an important distinction. Schedule III means the drug still has a recognized medical use, unlike Schedule I drugs like heroin or cannabis at the time. This was critical as hospitals still needed it desperately for anesthesia. But Schedule III meant that it was deemed to have a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence and abuse. It significantly increased the penalties for trafficking and non-medical use, and crucially, it put a massive amount of regulatory pressure on the pharmaceutical supply chain to prevent diversion. This scheduling helped stem the flow from legitimate pharmaceutical sources and slowly changed the nature of the street market. It made the drug harder to get, riskier to possess, and eventually contributed to a reduction in its peak popularity in the rave scene, though it certainly didn't disappear. But just as its life as a party drug was being restricted, something completely new and extraordinary was happening back in the laboratory. The serious research into ketamine, which had been dormant for decades due to the psychedelic stigma and the street use reputation, was about to be revived in a spectacular and deeply ironic way. While one group of researchers was desperately trying to fix the bladders of ketamine users, another group was quietly discovering that a very small, controlled dose of the exact same drug could do something entirely unexpected. It could fix the mind. Let's gently transition now to the 21st century and the astonishing, paradigm-shifting discovery of ketamine's antidepressant power.
We have arrived, finally, in the 21st century. Ketamine, the chemical that started as a chemical modification of angel dust, saved lives in Vietnam
and gave ravers profound, often bladder-destroying trips, was about to undergo its most significant and most respectable transformation yet. The stage for this final act was the quiet, determined world of psychiatric research, specifically to search for a new type of drug to combat the oldest and most stubborn mental illnesses, major depression and suicidal ideation. The unmet need and the failed models. For decades, psychiatric pharmacology had been relying on a model called the monoamine hypothesis. This theory suggested that depression was caused by a simple chemical imbalance, specifically low levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. The most popular antidepressants, SSRIs like Prozac, worked by increasing the availability of these monoamines. The problem? These drugs work slowly, sometimes taking 4 to 8 weeks to show any effect, if they work at all. And for about 1/3 of people with major depression, they simply don't work. These patients are categorized as having treatment-resistant depression, or TRD. For these individuals, the waiting is agonizing, and the failure can be fatal, especially when rapid intervention is needed for suicidal thoughts. By the early 2000s, there was a quiet desperation among researchers to find a drug that worked on an entirely different system and, crucially, worked fast. The serendipitous discovery, blocking the NMDA receptor, the breakthrough moment, which we can point to as the genesis of modern ketamine psychiatry, occurred around 2000 to 2006. Researchers knew that ketamine's anesthetic and psychoactive effects were due to its action as an NMDA receptor antagonist. This is a complicated way of saying that ketamine blocks the receptor site for the neurotransmitter glutamate. Glutamate is the brain's main excitatory chemical. It speeds things up. Blocking it leads to the slowdown and dissociation we've been talking about. This was the anesthetic mechanism. But a small group of researchers, notably those at the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, in the U.S., wondered if this action had an unforeseen psychiatric benefit. In 2000, a researcher named Dr. Robert Berman published a small but explosive paper in the journal Biological Psychiatry. He gave depressed patients an infusion of ketamine, not an anesthetic dose, but a very low sub-anesthetic dose, and observed the results. The findings were staggering. Within hours, not weeks, but hours, the subject's symptoms of depression dramatically improved. This was an effect that was completely unheard of in the history of antidepressant pharmacology. It was a speed that redefined what was possible. In 2006, the NIMH confirmed this effect in a more rigorous placebo-controlled study led by Dr. Carlos Zarate. They found that a single intravenous infusion of low-dose ketamine produced robust antidepressant effects that lasted for several days and sometimes up to a week in patients with severe treatment-resistant depression. This was the pharmaceutical equivalent of finding gold, a rapid-acting antidepressant working on an entirely new system, the glutamogenic system, provided immediate relief for patients who were running out of options. But how did it work? It wasn't just about blocking glutamate. The current understanding, which is still evolving, is much more interesting. It turns out that when ketamine blocks the NMDA receptor, it causes a cascade of downstream effects that essentially repair the brain. Chronic stress and depression cause the brain's neurons, particularly in areas related to mood and cognition, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, to atrophy. The dendrites, the branches of the neuron that communicate with other cells, actually shrivel up, reducing communication pathways. Ketamine doesn't just block a chemical. It appears to rapidly trigger the growth of new dendritic spines and synapses. It's like it's quickly refertilizing a withered landscape of brain cells. This process is called synaptogenesis, or neuroplasticity. So ketamine doesn't just put a chemical band-aid on depression. It seems to help the brain physically restructure itself, allowing for new, healthier communication patterns to emerge. The psychological experience during the treatment, the brief dissociation, is now thought by some to be the key part of the process, helping to break rigid negative thought patterns. The modern landscape, S-ketamine and legal clinics. The result of this research has been the creation of an entirely new therapeutic field. Since 2006, ketamine clinics offering intravenous infusions have sprung up across the world, operating legally under the premise of using an FDA-approved drug, ketamine, in an off-label manner to treat depression. This is the medical world catching up to the underground knowledge that this drug affects the mind in profound ways. The pharmaceutical world, of course, noticed the immense potential. Since ketamine is a generic drug, it can't be patented. So, drug companies look to patent a slightly modified version. In 2019, the FDA approved S-ketamine, marketed as Spravato by Janssen. This is the S version of the molecule, and it's approved specifically for treatment-resistant depression and suicidal ideation, delivered as a nasal spray in a closely monitored setting. This official approval solidified ketamine's transition from a battlefield anesthetic to a legitimate, cutting-edge psychiatric treatment. It's an incredible irony. The same core molecule that was deemed too psychoactive for standard surgery in the 1960s, too dangerous for the streets in the 1990s, is now being hailed as the most significant breakthrough in treating depression in the last half-century. Its ability to create profound yet temporary dissociation is no longer a side effect, but the very mechanism of its psychological healing. The lasting legacy. So, there we have it, the long, strange, slightly sleepy journey of ketamine. It started with a quest to fix a chemical flaw in PCP, moved through the jungles of Vietnam as a military lifesaver, briefly visited John C. Lilly's dolphin tank, spent a decade as the shadowy staple of the global rave scene, and now, finally, resides in the quiet, sterile setting of psychiatric clinics, rebuilding the minds of those who have run out of hope. Its story is a perfect example of how chemical compounds rarely stay in the lane the chemists originally intended. They find their own path, their own purpose, whether that's saving a life on a muddy battlefield or, perhaps more profoundly, offering a path back to life for someone trapped by their own mind. Now, if you're still awake, and I really hope you're not, you can rest easy knowing that even the most complex, most controversial molecules have their own unique, slow history. Good night and sweet dreams.